If there's one thing us cyclists will never have to worry about, it's not having enough options when choosing a new bike. In fact, there's so many options that even something as seemingly simple as what material your frame is made out of can get pretty confusing pretty fast. Sadly, however, there isn't a simple one-size-fits-all answer for all riders across all disciplines. So what I'm going to do in this video is give you the pros and cons of aluminum, carbon fiber, steel, and titanium, in hopes that it helps you when you choose your next bike. And speaking of help, if you wouldn't mind helping out our channel by going down there and hitting that like and subscribe button, we at 99 Spokes would really appreciate that. And while you're doing that, I'm going to start off with what's become the unequivocal standard for bicycle frame manufacturing: aluminum. Aluminum frames can be found on bikes ranging from less than $100 to over $10,000. So it's no surprise that it is one of the most versatile materials on the market. And just like the other materials we're going to talk about, it does have its own specific pros and cons. If any of you have ever been on the market for a new bike, then you already know the first big strength of aluminum frames, and that's that they are relatively inexpensive. But that's just the top of the list. Aluminum is also relatively durable, pretty dang strong, and is corrosion resistant, which means you don't need to worry about your aluminum bike rusting. Lastly, aluminum has a very stiff, responsive, and efficient ride feel, making it the frame material of choice for a lot of velodrome and BMX race athletes. But that stiffness also translates to the first con that we're going to talk about here, because it can create a bit of a harsher, rougher ride feel than some of the other materials on this list. It's also slightly heavier than carbon fiber, so riders seeking the lightest possible bike will oftentimes look elsewhere. So who is an aluminum bike for? Well, firstly, if you're on a budget or just can't stomach the idea of spending more than $2,000 on a bike, then an aluminum option is great for you. I mentioned this earlier, but other people who might seek out an aluminum frame are those who prioritize a really stiff, responsive, kind of snappy ride feel, so people like BMX racers or mountain bike racers. And then finally, just average commuters. If you're just using your bike to get around, then aluminum is a great material. You don't need to worry about it rusting, and it's not going to cost you an arm and a leg. The next frame material we're talking about has become commonplace on performance bikes across all disciplines of cycling, and that is, of course, carbon fiber. And without a doubt, the biggest reason why carbon fiber has become so prolific is that it has the highest strength to weight ratio of any of the materials we're talking about today. It should also go without saying that since carbon fiber is not metal, you don't need to worry about any kind of rust or corrosion. However, if you're not taking good care of your bike, in other words, leaving it outside the elements, the epoxy in that carbon fiber can wear down over the years. Now, the next big pro of carbon fiber comes from the manufacturing process. Since it's not made up of metal tubing, the manufacturers can kind of assemble that bike in any way or shape they want to, which allows for some pretty cool looking bikes, but also bikes that perform really well. Engineers can pick and choose the way they lay up the carbon fiber by changing the direction or the number of layers to make the bike, say, stiffer in one direction, but more compliant in another, optimizing the ride feel. And lastly, carbon fiber is repairable. So if and when you do get a bit of a ding or a nick taken out of your frame, you can usually send it back to the manufacturer and they'll be able to repair that for you. But that does lead me to dings and nicks, which is the first con that we're going to talk about for carbon fiber. I mentioned earlier that carbon fiber has a very high specific strength, but it doesn't do very well with impacts. So if you're a rider who maybe throws his bike around a lot, like say a slopestyle or dirt jump athlete, carbon fiber probably wouldn't be best for you. The argument could also be made that it's less environmentally friendly than other types of bicycle manufacturing because it's not recyclable and there is a little bit more waste in the manufacturing process. And speaking of manufacturing, it does take a little bit more time to prototype and build a carbon fiber mold than it does to make lugs for aluminum, steel, or titanium tubing. And that time does turn into a cost that gets passed on to us, the consumers, and that's the final con I'll talk about with carbon fiber, in that it does tend to be relatively expensive. Definitely more expensive than aluminum and oftentimes more expensive than steel or even titanium. So who should choose a carbon fiber frame? Well, again, they are very common in all disciplines of mountain biking, road cycling, gravel riding, and if you're worried about whether they're strong enough for you, I can assure you that they are. If you want an ultra lightweight bike that's going to be more stiff and responsive than a soft and supple ride feel, then it's hard to beat carbon fiber, just as long as you're okay spending the money for it. Next up, we come to what is one of my personal favorite frame materials, and that is steel. Steel is one of the first materials that bikes were ever made of, and up until the 80s or 90s, it was pretty much commonplace to have all bicycles made out of steel. In addition to being stronger and more dent resistant than aluminum, one of the biggest reasons why riders choose a steel frame is the ride feel, which can be described as being soft or compliant. Essentially, steel allows just a little bit of flex in the material, and that means if you're on a gravel ride, it's going to absorb some of those vibrations, or if you're on a hardtail mountain bike, it'll take the edge out of some of those bigger hits. But what about the cons? Well, the biggest con of steel tubing is that it is not light. Steel is by far the heaviest material on this list, so if you're looking for a light bike, then steel is probably not the best option for you. I also mentioned earlier that steel gives a soft, more compliant ride feel, and so for athletes who are looking to have the most efficient bike, then steel is not going to be a great option for them. Essentially, some of your power is going to get absorbed in the frame instead of being translated into motion. Lastly, just about all types of steel tubing does rust or corrode over time, so if you have to leave your bike outside or you're worried about that, then steel might not be best for you. But who should choose a steel bike? Well, really, there's two main categories here, and that's people who are looking for a very strong bike or the most comfortable or compliant bike. Athletes that fall into these categories might be city commuters, gravel riders, BMX riders, or folks like myself who like to ride hardtail mountain bikes. Steel is a great material for hardtails. The fourth and final bicycle frame material that we're talking about today is by far the bougiest, and it's a material that I've dreamed about owning for years, and that is titanium. So what sets titanium apart from the other metals on this list? Well, honestly, it's the balance that it has. It's nearly as light as aluminum, but just as strong and compliant as steel. It's also extremely resistant to corrosion and oxidation. And what that means is that if this frame has been built correctly, it can probably last you the rest of your life. But you are going to have to pay for it because titanium frames are usually some of the most expensive of any of the materials we've talked about on this list. And that comes from two different reasons. Number one, titanium is hard to source and therefore very expensive. And number two, the manufacturing process of titanium costs a lot of money. Not going to go too much into that, but essentially it has to be welded in a vacuum. And that complex manufacturing process means that there tends to be more manufacturing errors with titanium frames than the other types of metals on this list. That's why if you're going to buy a Ti frame, you definitely want to buy it from a company with a good track record. So who should buy titanium? If you're looking for a bike that can perform at an elite level and take a lot of the different strengths of the other materials we've talked about today and combine them into one, then titanium is a great option. Next, for better or for worse, titanium also serves as a bit of a status symbol. So if you want to have a bike that's a little bit different and is going to set yourself apart from your peers, then titanium is probably a good way to go. And lastly, like I mentioned earlier, if you're looking for a frame that will last you a lifetime, then titanium is hard to beat. Ultimately, the best frame material really comes down to your specific needs and riding preferences. And in a second here, I'm going to share with you a chart that I've made to help make this a little bit easier. But first, if you've made it this far in the video, I'd really appreciate it if you just take 1 second to go down there and hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. This will not only help other people find this video and be able to learn from it too, but it'll also make sure that you don't miss any videos from us. We'll be uploading a new long-form video every Friday. But now for the promised chart. To use it, simply identify your priorities on the left side and see which material scores highest in each one. Then add the total score for each material and voila, your best frame material. I'll put a link to a PDF of this chart down there in the description, so if you want to download your own copy to fill out, you are free to do so. And lastly, if you have any questions about any of these frame materials or maybe some bikes that are on your short list to buy, please go ahead and let me know in the comments, and I'll do my best to answer those. Thanks again for tuning in. Remember that bikes are for everyone. Have fun out there.